Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Madeline Fitzgerald, and I'm the manager of adult programming here at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. On behalf of the museum, I would especially like to welcome and thank our members who are in the audience this evening. It is because of all of you that our museum and exhibitions are free and open to everyone. First, a special thanks to the Tarrant County Education Foundation for their activity collaboration during tonight's second Thursday at the Carter. Be sure to visit the library this evening to check them out and learn about their organization. Additionally, we would like to thank the staff at Hired Hands for providing American Sign Language interpretation for tonight's lecture. Thank you. But tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers. Joining us this evening is Jonica Rivers, who will be moderating the conversation between our co-curators of the Black Everyday exhibition. Jonica Rivers is a writer, editor, and curator whose work explores race and place. She is particularly interested in the relationship between peripatetic ways of being and Black women's cultural and intellectual production. Her current slate of projects includes work as curator at large for the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, where she advises on exhibitions and programming, and she leads editorial strategy for the Harriet Jacobs Project, a division of State Historical Sites Initiative. Jonica will be leading the conversation between the Carter's Associate Curator of Photographs, Kristen Gaylord on the far end, and Lauren Cross right in the middle. Lauren Cross is an interdisciplinary artist and filmmaker, as well as a scholar. She is the founder of the arts nonprofit WOCA Projects in Fort Worth, Texas, and program coordinator and assistant professor of interdisciplinary art and design studies at the University of North Texas. Her research addresses critical multicultural approaches in arts practice, arts entrepreneurship, curatorial studies, museum studies, and art history. Cross is the director of the award-winning documentary, The Skin Quilt Project, which was produced in 2010 and was an official selection at the 2010 International Black Women's Film Festival in Berkeley, California. In 2018, Cross was an inaugural Carter Community Artist for the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. And most recently, she was the guest curator for Contemporary Arts Month in San Antonio, as well as the 2020 Fall Artist in Residency program for Art Pace in San Antonio. After their conversation this evening, we will transition into a Q&A with all of you. I will have a microphone for audience members to use, and this will be primarily so that your questions will be heard on the recording of tonight's talk. We will be uploading the recording of tonight's lecture to the Carter's YouTube account in the coming weeks, and you can find all of our previous lectures on there as well. So please join me in welcoming Jonica Rivers, Lauren Cross, and Kristen Gaylord.
So on our first slide, which is actually the next slide, there we go. Let's discuss the images that you selected to open the show with. We have the Nichols daguerreotype, Wayne Cotton, and the Leonard Freed print. What message are you communicating to the viewer?
Great question. So when Kristen approached me about the Black Everyday Project, one of the key things that we wanted to talk about was to challenge stereotypical representations of the Black experience. And in these images, you know, it felt like it was necessary to also acknowledge, well, what are those different representations? What do they look like? And how does the rest of the show work to challenge that? So that's kind of what the first initial images, they really set the tone to think about how history really informs our representations. But then also there are these other representations we don't get a chance to see. And that is what the rest of the show is really serving to to provide that perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, too, it's a diversity of images in some ways, not in other ways, of course, of the kinds of moments that are being shown, but it's also a diversity in terms of history. So we have a really, really early photograph from the 1850s. We have mass media postcards from around the turn of the century. We have an image from the 70s. And I think most of our visitors can look at these and say, oh, and these images are familiar to me today still. I know the stereotypes and the sorts of moments that are being focused on here. And now I'm entering the rest of the show cognizant of what the rest of the show is not doing, what else is happening in this gallery.
So the show is broken into 6 sections. So we have the first section, which is this is what we're not doing. This is what we're not portraying. And then you get into community, labor, family, excellence, and vernacular. So can you break those down for us?
So for community, well, first, just speaking of those sections, I think when we were thinking about the selection, because there's way more images in the collection that reflect the Black experience than what are shown in the gallery. So I think our job was to try to identify the narratives within the collection and then try to create a consensus across those narratives so that we weren't doing way too much in one area and leaving gaps in the other. So these were categories that at least for me, felt necessary and were represented within a lot of Black Studies scholarship. And so as I was looking through the collection, those were the things that stood out to me. So just to kind of break down where those themes came from.
Yeah. And I think, this is a collection show. So this is something that Lauren and I based on what is unique about the Carter in our collection. This story could be told at lots of museums in lots of different ways. But I think, we had to start with the collection and also with Lauren's expertise in Black Studies and sort of see where the overlaps were and where the gaps were, too, which we couldn't fill because we didn't get loans for this. We didn't commission new work. It's as much a story about how Blackness has looked at the Carter as it is about mass media representations of Blackness.
Absolutely. And I think that's the critical opportunity within a show like this is to challenge the collection and say, well, what is missing? There's certainly other aspects of the Black experience that certainly could have been there, but that wasn't in the collection. Mm-hmm. So it allowed us to kind of earmark those themes and then speak to those themes in expansive ways.
As a curator of photographs at the Carter, what were some of the strengths and some of the gaps that you picked up on through the process?
Yeah, so there were a lot more images of children than of adults, which I think there's reasons for that. There were also, more images of people in public spaces because in terms of privacy laws and copyright and getting access, it's much easier to take pictures of people at a park or in a public space than it is to gain access to more private spaces. We also did find a lot of more formal portraits, and we'll see where we put a lot of those. And Lauren and I were trying to focus on more casual everyday moments, but formal portraiture has seemed to be a way also that a lot of images of Black Americans made their way into the collection as well.
And Lauren, would you say between white photographers and Black photographers, not just in terms of images, but whose lenses primarily made it into the collection?
There's definitely a primarily white lens, and that was something that we were very intentional about acknowledging. And that was something I was probably like, okay, so what is the breakdown of the different photographers and how can we address that in different ways? Some of that we addressed through the vernacular photos, which we'll get to a little bit later. But some of that was to identify where there were Black photographers, how can we give a special nod to them? So we had additional exhibition label text for those Black photographers. So it's an opportunity to introduce visitors and give them a little bit more information about them.
Yeah. Maybe we want to go to the community. We could just talk through really briefly. I'm hoping many of you have seen the show, and if you haven't, you can go up tonight after this. But we have just some example images and installation shots if you haven't been upstairs yet for each of the sections. Do you want to do community?
Yeah, and my first question, which goes piggybacks off of that one is here you have Roy DeCarava, James Vanderzee, and Early Hudnall, who's a Texan for all who don't know. And so you have the lens of 3 Black male photographers, which is, very specific. And the question that we've discussed before is there a Black aesthetic, and is there a sightline that's specific to the Black eye?
Yeah, I think there absolutely is one. There's lots of literature that confirm that. But I think in terms of photography, I think it is, for me, having a bit of a photo background is the sensitivity to the Black subject. And you can tell through each of their works that they're also focusing on certain types of community events. Some of it can be technical in terms of DeCarava, but it's also like thinking about like, what does it mean to be represented as a Black person in photography, like the medium of photography, which wasn't necessarily built around representing Black people. So how do you address those challenges from an aesthetic standpoint? So you can definitely see each of these photographers doing that in different ways. And Hudnall in particular, he's being very sensitive in terms of how he's composing the subjects and really representing them in a way to where we can feel more of their humanity in a way that we might not see in another photographer's work. So.
Yeah, we also tried to feature the Black artists in PowerPoint as well as the sort of extended labels. And this section has a wealth of photographers who are really not just Black photographers, but some of the most important American photographers of the 20th century. And I think it's also nice to show that diversity of community spaces, which Lauren has talked about really eloquently. In that community can mean something different. In the image on the right on the installation, you can see that's a church image. And of course, DeCarava is an interior in a nightclub. Those are probably, especially given the time period, quite Black spaces, coded Black spaces, where some of the exterior images on the wall are more public places where you see, that, and Lauren has talked about being more open, but also maybe being less safe for the Black Americans who are spending time there. So you do kind of go back and forth between that privacy and that publicity in all the images on the wall.
Yeah, there was definitely I love to talk about that kind of private public, so these are community environments that are not necessarily open to the like wider public, but they're public from a community standpoint. And then of course these, in public spaces, it's more like clearly in public space. And how you can carve out a Black space even in a public arena by events or different types of programming that one might do.
Can you get a little into DeCarava's technical approach and the specificity of his style?
Yeah, so, and I'm sure Kristen would love to jump in too. DeCarava is actually one of my favorites because he's known for printing very dark, and his style is very much, all of his work has those dark tones. But I think that the rationale behind it, I think people don't talk about that as much. Like just the way in which photography wasn't necessarily built around representing Black people. That means that when you're going into certain environments, how are Black people captured, in a dark, he did a lot of representation of like jazz, one of our images is like John Coltrane. So like, how do you represent Black people in a dark jazz, environment? That wasn't necessarily built around that, but he really celebrated that and honored that and didn't see that as a problem. It's like, no, this is, almost in a way a nod to the Black experience, that like that darkness is celebrated in his work, which I always love that.
Yeah, and then rounding the corner, the next wall is labor, actually 2 little walls. And this is a smaller section, nodding back to where the gaps are. We had fewer images, which is why we put it on a smaller wall in just a practical way. But something that Lauren and I wanted to do here is acknowledge as many kinds of labor as we could. So we have uncompensated labor and compensated labor. We have activists, as you see here. We also have an image of carceral labor, people in a Texas penitentiary working for little to no wages, and then people who have all sorts of other jobs. So this is a more recent acquisition of someone who's an engineer. We had the military represented, of course, a history of that being sometimes an avenue for Black advancement when others were closed. And a charwoman, people selling flowers on the street, just like every instance we could to, again, show the wide variety and not just focus on agricultural labor or other kinds that you see in more, in history textbooks all the time.
Speaking of that range of labor, you have the SNCC activists, the carceral labor. And as you're going through this, just expound on, because the thought I had was that Black labor in the United States, really anywhere in the world, it is never solely an economic pursuit. And that's what this section really illustrated for me.
Yeah, I think that was important to me because, as you see these works about resistance, one might try to say, well, is that really about the everyday experience? And I would say yes, because that is a part of the everyday experience, whether it's what's happening in this image or like how you might experience things on your job or just walking down the street. So it seemed important to acknowledge that type of labor in that conversation. And that was something that I was like, I think we should definitely include that because that matters.
And you mentioned not highlighting a lot of agricultural labor. Is that more common in photography collections if we're looking for
Black we
labor?
Definitely probably had more of those, especially historic images. And, whenever I give tours, I often mention Jerry Craft's quote, the author, about all the Black representation he saw being either history or misery. Those are the two options. And I think that history one we get a lot, and it's often that agricultural labor. That image in the first slide of Wayne Cotton, that was from 1900. There's a long period of American history when that image could have been taken, and you can't quite even tell because that was a dynamic here for so long. And there's an image in this section of men picking cotton, and it's incarcerated men. And it also looks like it could have been taken over many hundreds of years in this country. So I think something that Lauren and I talked about a lot throughout the show is we don't want to erase that as a Black everyday experience. We didn't want to focus on that. So there are places throughout where we wanted to make sure the audience knew we were acknowledging that that is a reality, but that was not mainly what the show was going to be about.
I think that was an important aspect to, again, just acknowledge that these are the range of different types of labor experiences. Mm-hmm.
So then we have family, which family and vernacular are probably my two favorite sections of the show. Elizabeth Alexander writes a lot about Black interiors, both our interiority, but also the interiors of our homes and our spaces, our third spaces. And that is the feeling I really, really got from this section. So can you expound upon the images that you selected to represent the notion of family?
Well, this was a really special section to me from the standpoint of these are often people's personal spaces. And as we talked about, many of the photographers in the show were not necessarily Black photographers. So to be able to capture some of these very intimate moments of people's lives, it indicates that there may have been some sort of relationship or there was access given in order to capture them. And we can see some of that happening in the community wall as well. But I thought that especially in the family section, I just don't think, maybe I'm just thinking about myself. I don't just think, anybody can come and take pictures. Me and my family. Maybe I may take a lot of pictures of me and my family, but that's not necessarily anybody else. So to me, there was a sense of wow, that's very vulnerable position to be in. And, one must really trust, that someone can accurately document that in different ways. There's some public representations in the family area as well.
Yeah. So. This was one where we noticed, for instance, we had a lot of images of Black mothers and children, and a lot of them are beautiful. And we did include 3 or 4 partly to acknowledge the centrality of Black mothers and mothering in communities. But we tried to get a diversity of families. So it's not just children who are young. There's also, adult children with their parents or more extended families. One of my favorites is the preacher's family on the street who's, singing and evangelizing together. Again, this was one where we had to make some painful cuts because we did have a lot in this particular area in the collection.
Yeah, especially children. And I'm a mother of 2. Shout out to my kids back here. So all the little Black kids, I was like, oh, I can't cut it. So she had to hold me back a little bit.
We had to cut
the children part because I was like, well, we gotta cut that. But that happens when you're curating. You're trying to have that diversity of different experiences represented, and you don't want to just pick things that you would necessarily feel, connected to. You're thinking about others too. What are images that others might really gravitate to or be inspired by as well?
So I want to talk about the co-curation / culling process. So we have an in-house curator, an external collaborator. And what was that process as you were going through the collection and having to make those cuts?
Yeah, co-curating can take a lot of different forms. What I tried to do, and Lauren can say if it was successful or not, was make her an absolute partner in everything that I would ever do for a show. So all I did on my own was write the proposal and ask her to join. And then from then on, if she wanted to, every meeting, every sort of logistical, even if it was a boring, unfun thing, I wanted her to be involved. So the checklist was basically us just having a lot of conversations with images. We looked at prints in person. We looked at checklists, printed out, making cuts, but then sometimes one of us would convince the other to keep that one instead. So at least from my vantage, it was a very collaborative process.
I honestly would say that co-curating with Kristen has been one of my favorites. And that says a lot. But I think she was very sensitive to, as she said, like, what do you think about this? Would you like to join in all these different meetings? And what that did with it created opportunity for me to kind of, if there was something that I, philosophically felt like, this is not hitting right, I could mention that. And she was very, she listened and would be like, okay, well, if you don't want it, that's it. And there was definitely some moments with some of the images of, there were some images of violence. And I just felt really conflicted about that because I felt like, in the Black community, we've seen a lot of traumatic images. And I didn't want to not acknowledge that, but I also understand what it means to walk into a museum that, one might say is a white space, and to see those types of images could be very violent and very not welcoming. So I was really concerned by that. And it was very vulnerable for me to be like, okay, I'm about to be real Black right now and be like, this is really bothering me. And she just let me let it all out and just be like, I feel like others would feel harmed by this. And it's not like she was fighting for the image, but there was that sense of well, how much do you share, before it's too much? So that was a challenging part for me. But I think that's also photography is that type of medium where it can feel so real, and there were some moments where I was like, I'm not contributing to that part,
And this is why Lauren was necessary. I mean, I never was going to do the show without a co-curator. I am the expert on the collection at the Carter. I know this really well, but I'm not an expert on Black studies, and I don't know what it means to live as a Black person. So that was from the beginning, I was relying on her for exactly that scholastic knowledge and academia, but also that lived and communal knowledge of this is something that seems, might seem fine or worth it to you, but isn't, and I'm going to tell you why. And I always wanted to defer to her in those circumstances.
And I really appreciated the collaboration, especially when we were writing the labels, because that was where, like, so you make these decisions from the work, like these are the works that are going to make it. But then the labels is kind of like, so why?
Yeah.
Why did you choose that? You kind of have to justify at that point your decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also want to help your visitors to be able to interpret why you made those decisions.
Yeah.
And so that was the fun back and forth process of a lot of conversations. Yep. Okay, this is why I think we need to say this because I don't want this to be misinterpreted. So it was really fruitful.
Yeah, there were works that were like,
sense.
We can't put this in the show and not give people some context for it.
Yeah.
I appreciate your remark on labels because as a writer, I can, a recent show, not here, I can tell when I'm looking at a Black work and the label has been written solely by a white person. And I usually test it, and it's you can tell in the voice and in the framing. So I appreciate that.
I really enjoyed that part of the process because it really was a good decompressing part of.
Yeah, and I'll say too, when you're writing, as opposed to academic writing, when you're writing a label for museum, you're writing for the visitor. Well, who are you imagining that visitor to be is a major question. And I think that was another thing that Lauren and I talked about is, if someone is going to feel like this label is speaking to them and we have to make a choice for who that person is, who are we going to choose in that, writing? And our audience here, like most museums, is majority white. But that was not who we imagined and wanted to talk to in this particular exhibition. So that also was a different writing tone and imagined audience than we, would have done otherwise.
So then we have the Black Excellence section. The writer Kiese Laymon talks about Black excellence being this sort of very narrow thing that often can feel like a noose, if you will, because there's notions of respectability, what is excellence, and it's usually this just very narrow definition. So can you discuss how you expounded upon excellence as just being Black every day is a form of excellence and not confining it to what the traditional notion of Black excellence is?
Yeah, I think that was, for me, it was the sense of we had all these portraits of all these amazing contributors. And again, someone could say, well, is that really like representing the everyday experience? And I was like, well, yeah, because these are everyday people. They're, human beings that have a world outside of their contributions. And just because they made a contribution doesn't mean that they're not an everyday person. So I wanted to normalize that part, that we all are contributing things within our lives. And we were very intentional about, who we were selecting. Certainly there's like some familiar faces, but then there were like moments where you were like, but, some people may not know, Ralph Bunche, or they may not know certain figures. They should. Because they've made important contributions, but their names may not kind of ring in the same way. And so we made intentional choices to represent people that might not have, been as, their names might not be common in some ways. But then on another token, they are familiar and within the Black community, obviously. So that was important.
Yes, I was very proud that there is an archival photo of a Hampton University professor, which is my alma mater.
Yeah, we did try to get a diverse, we tried to make sure there were a lot of women. So there's 5 or 6 women on the wall, and from people who had made accomplishments in lots of different fields. So of course, entertainment and the arts are well represented, but we also, we have the professor, we have Bunche the diplomat, we have, of course, this is sort of the Martin Luther King. This is where he goes in this show, which was, again, like most institutions, when Black History Month comes around, we're talking about those things on our social media and other places. And, this is a photo that comes up in that context. And for me, it was kind of fun to make sure that it still showed up, but not in that very institutional, like, it's Black History Month, we're talking about this, and now it's March and we're not way, but instead putting him in context of all these other wonderful Black Americans that we may or may not know about. And there's one image of people who are not identified. We don't know their names. They were actors in a movie that's not been digitized. It's hard to research. And that was also kind of there's more to be done. There are more people like this that we should be learning about that we might not know about yet.
Vernacular. So please define for everyone what vernacular photography is, which I think at its simplest phrase, it's anything that's not art photography. But what does that mean?
Yeah, it's anything that wasn't made specifically as art, sort of normal photography, what the majority of photography is. Photography is often called a language. So like any language, you could use it for poetry or for a technical manual, right? It can be all sorts of things, unlike paintings, which tend to only be made as art objects. And so art museums have a relationship to vernacular where I once wrote a paper that compared the art world to the Blob, the old horror film that kind of can subsume anything it touches, because these were not made as art photographs, but a lot of other photographs in our collection also weren't. They were made by surveyors in the 19th century. They were made as personal portraits. And they tell something about the history of the medium, so there's a place for them at the museum. But to sort of differentiate them, whether that's necessary or not, we call them vernacular. These are more traditionally vernacular in that they're mostly snapshots. So as opposed to a formal portrait taken at a school that might eventually end up in an art museum, these are mostly very clearly family and community snapshots.
And that was sort of the big feature for me, was that they had a very personal feel to them. And they really speak in a lot of ways in and out of the other categories in the show. So, whether it's the excellence wall, whether it's, family and community and labor, they all they're every day, they're taken by, it could be me or you, but they're representing experiences that might be about these other things. So it kind of encompasses all of the things that are in the show put together. And I was really excited about the opportunity to show as many of the vernacular photos as we could, because again, we knew that going into it that there was going to be an imbalance in terms of representation of Black photographers, and how we were situating the vernacular was to look at them as, these are probably taken by family members, close friends. So this is probably a lot of Black photographers and this one collection. And so it allowed an opportunity to really get a glimpse of different viewpoints. We don't know, and some of the people, the names, because people have written that you should definitely write your names on the back of your photo.
And dates.
And who took the photo. That definitely hit me working with this collection, but you get that sense of wow, this is people's lives, being presented before you.
And actually the next slide might have some closer up examples too for people who haven't seen the show yet.
And how does a museum end up with our family photos? Can you walk us through how our grandmother's photos end up in the Carter's collection?
That's a good question. So these were part of a gift that the museum accepted in 2020 from someone who collects vernacular photography. His name is Peter Cohen. He's a well-known and very generous, he gifts to all major museums in the country, vernacular collector. He's been doing this for a very long time and categorizes them by his own very charming and sort of idiosyncratic method. So for instance, he published a book with MoMA called Women Standing on Lawns, because he just had collected hundreds of pictures of women standing on lawns by themselves. And it's a whole book and you can buy it. So he had made a gift to us in 2016. And for that gift, we had focused on color images and really high quality, not faded, not damaged, beautiful color snapshots. This in 2020, when he and I, his collection manager and I started talking, one of his categories was African Americans. And after the murder of George Floyd, obviously racial issues and how we depict Black Americans was at the forefront of my mind and lots of my colleagues' minds. And so we decided to focus the gift on that. Usually when you accept a gift from Peter, you get to go to his New York apartment, his 60,000 photographs in boxes, and you kind of rifle through and pick out ones that he has gotten from eBay and vintage stores and antique fairs and flea markets and things. Because it was COVID, he shipped us a large number, and we looked through and accepted about 243 of them. And about 180 of those are in this show. There are really legitimate questions about whether photographs should sort of take that route. But part of it is they somehow entered the market. Whether it was an estate sale, the family didn't want the photographs. Maybe it was an album that got taken apart. There's all sorts of ways that those would have eventually ended up in a flea market, and for someone like Peter to have collected them. There are really different dynamics involved when it's international photos that might have had to do with invasions and colonialism and things. These are probably a little bit more someone neglected to keep them or keep them in the family, and so they sort of made their way out into the world.
Yeah. Which I think poses a really good, thing to think about. And me and my mom, as a result of this project, have been like, okay, let's, put together this photo collection and think about it's like estate planning, like where are the photos going to go? Mm-hmm. Because, thankful for the Peter Cohen collection, but I think that it's important to think about how you preserve your own family's photos if, mm-hmm. If you want them to stay in the family.
Mm-hmm. Black Family Archives is something I obsessively think about, particularly, and not to be end of worldish, but with climate change and migration, or even just storms, snowstorms. Mm-hmm. How do you get the family photos and the family documents? How do you preserve them properly and have the assigned person that knows, this is the thing. If you leave the house with nothing else, this is what you leave with.
Mm-hmm. Evidently, there's a whole area on photo estate planning mm-hmm. So if you're interested, look that up. So it's a really elaborate process, and some people might digitize all of their photos and keep them, spread them around, have digital access codes and stuff, but it's interesting.
And I think it's this is an institutional self-reflection in some ways, this exhibition. It's a really good question. These ended up out in the world, and they let us do something that we couldn't do without them. They let our visitors see something that they couldn't see without them, and they let us think about things we couldn't see without them. But in an ideal world, would it have been better for them to stay with the descendants of the subjects? I would say yes. So I do think that's an interesting tension of we are really grateful for what they can do for us, but that's maybe not the ideal scenario for what happens to them.
And we also talked about what's the difference between vernacular photos being a part of a museum versus a genealogical mm-hmm. society.
Right.
And that here in the Carter, they really serve a more collective purpose. It allows us to really talk about the collection of those images, whereas in a historical society or a genealogical society, you're able to focus on the people themselves, and it's about their specific lives. Mm-hmm. So I think that's important to think about.
And in that place, they wouldn't have been sort of taken out of their original context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're there for the preservation of that person's legacy.
All righty, Deanna Lawson, let's get into it. So art versus vernacular. So with Deanna Lawson, would you say that her style is a bridge, that she's really calling upon the form and the style of the everyday, but she is a fine art photographer? I also think we can get into the notion of Black excellence, because Deanna's work is received in very visceral ways by mm-hmm. some people, because they're like, why are you, portraying Black folks in this way? I love her work. It also gets into the Black interior. So let's dive into it. So on the left, we have fine art photography, which is a recent acquisition, which you could also share as to why you chose to acquire this for the collection, and then juxtapose against some of the vernacular photos.
Yeah, so I'll introduce the photo and then let Lauren handle everything else. So this is a recent acquisition we made. Dina Lawson, if you don't know, is a really sort of art world famous photographer right now. She had a solo exhibition at the Guggenheim recently, which has traveled to Germany because she won awards in both places. She had another solo show at MoMA PS1. Her prices have skyrocketed. She's really famous. She's a big deal. And so she's someone that we wanted in the collection because we collect the best of American photography, and she's that. If you've seen it, it's huge. She's really making a statement for the space on a wall that these women deserve. And the frame itself is gold leaf. So she's also sort of taken that Gilded Age idea of valuable, precious things around something that's valuable and precious, like art, and brought that into a modern, contemporary location. I will also say, and Lauren always notes this, some of her photographs are much more challenging than this one. A lot of them feature nudity. That wasn't a fit for what we were trying to do with the collection. And they often focus on working class Black Americans, often that she meets out in the world and then strikes up a conversation with and goes to their homes and poses these very formal portraits meant to look like vernacular, but really, with a large format camera in a very sort of serious photographic way. So I love this image, and it speaks to what she's talked about, it being about beauty, about how these women of very modest means still cultivate beauty in their lives. The detail she mentions is that the woman with the prosthetic leg has painted her toenails on her prosthetic leg to match her other leg. So, so much attentiveness to personal presentation. And they have, the flowers, and there's also the warmth between the woman and her daughter, right? So that's what Lawson talks about. But that's not always how people receive her images. And she is a Black woman herself, in case that wasn't clear. And so this is kind of a conversation that I back out of now at this point and let someone else handle.
Well, I think that there's an interesting conversation, I think, amongst Black art historians, and, in terms of the way in which the art world may fixate on certain types of Black artists. And so I think what I've said about this image is that this is the more tame version of Dina Lawson that I've seen in terms of the nudity and stuff like that. Because most of the critique has been because of the nudity and the way in which the images are so big that it can kind of dismantle itself, depending on who's viewing it. Mm-hmm. And some of the critics who've looked at it have been everyday Black people, even Black art critics and Black art historians looking at this in a museum and saying, something is not feeling right about this. And so I think there's a legit argument there. I think what's awesome about this particular image is because it speaks more to the vernacular, because it is it feels more like if vernacular is what she was trying to accomplish, she did it really well in this one, in a way that maybe certain viewers don't get it in the other ones, because then it's kind of you're bringing certain narratives out into a public view. And then now you're dealing with, images of the Black body, and, what are all of those things communicating to a more white audience? So then there's a sense of protection over those Black bodies and who's viewing them. So I think that's the conversation. It's really about hey, I don't think we should be doing that in this kind of space. But I think that what she does well in this particular one is that because it isn't, I hate to say, because they aren't nude, you're able to focus on who they are as people. And that's just the reality of representation. You have to think about, what are people going to be focusing on, when you have an image? And, some people might focus on the people. But if you have a nude, if the subjects are nude, you're going to have some people to focus more on the sexual aspect of things. And that has a very contentious history within the Black community, the Black photo history. I mean, it's very heavy. So I think, in a way, you know, she's tapping into something important in that sense, because she's bringing up all those ideas, but some people may not appreciate it as much as others.
I don't know if you've seen, there's a shoot that came out this week. I think it's GQ, but don't quote me on that. But the artist Sierra K. Walters did an Instagram story thread because this style has now been adopted by commercial and fashion photographers. So you're now seeing shoots in like Vogue of celebrities being staged in these very working class backgrounds. So in the shoot, Donald Glover is like on a slightly dingy mattress that's on the floor, and it's sort of staged into what would be considered like a Black working class household. And it's very much a Deanna Lawson style. But there were a lot of people that I saw on social media, because it just dropped, I think, Monday, that were critiquing. And I think this is what, like, when the elders say, like, oh, why are we showing our business? Because, and that's what I thought. I was like, oh, this is what happens, right? This is what happens. Now Vogue thinks it's chic to be on a dingy mattress on the floor. And this style of photography has been now taken completely out of context, and it's being used for commercial reasons. So as a scholar of Black studies and both photography, do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Well, I think this is not new, first. People have been doing that for a long time. I think we just are a little bit more, you know, aware of where those references come from in a way that maybe we weren't, you know, back in the day. People have been doing photos on dirty mattresses for a long time, but I know that sounds crazy, but no one really questioned it. You know, no one ever like traced the legacy or the genealogy of where those ideas came from, because you just assume that because it's in vogue that, oh, like this is the thing. And then of course everybody repeats it. I think we're a little bit more conscious as a culture. We're more aware of, you know, cultural aesthetics, Black aesthetics. And so because of that, we're able to call it out a lot more. And I think there's also a confidence, you know, in terms of there's more people willing to call it out in a way that maybe didn't exist before. So I think that's how I see it. It's like, oh, they've been doing that, you know. You know, cultural appropriation is not new, but it's the notion of like, well, what are we going to do as a community to call out like, oh, that's ours, you know, like twerking, that's ours, you know. And it's just that sense of like us speaking it out and having that platform to say like, no, that's not yours.
I think we're ready to move into the Q&A.
Okay. I had to ask my sister, do I stand up? More of her thing. So I haven't seen the exhibit yet, but my question is there a sports photograph that did not make the cut? And if you can think of that, why did it not make the cut? Of what is the photograph of?
Good question. So I know that there's an image of a basketball player on the vernacular wall, like a posed sort of high school or college shot. There is a photograph of a dancer, if you consider dance a sport, on the excellence wall. I don't know if there's and there's also a couple boxing images on the vernacular wall again. I don't think there's any more sports images on the non-vernacular walls. And that's probably just because historically this museum has not collected images that were more photojournalistic. So we have some sports images here and there, but it's not something we have well represented. But that's all I can think of.
Yeah, I don't think that I feel like it was ages ago. I don't recall that there was any that were represented.
There's also a football image on the vernacular wall. So I think that's where you'd find most of the sports images, which is an interesting question, actually.
Outside of the vernacular, I mean, I think that's also the beauty of the vernacular photos is that, you know, you're dealing with the collection of photographers and what they chose to focus on.
Yep.
and then, you know, versus how a community chooses to focus to represent themselves. So I think, you know, in terms of the difference between vernacular and other photos and the collection, like, you know, that's one way of understanding those differences.
I got one more. You're going to have to go play I Spy after this to find these all. There's a wonderful instant photograph of a woman standing next to a Michael Jordan cardboard cutout, which is a fun one too.
Most of what you have talked about tonight is the content of the actual photographs and your choices in doing that. But I know because the Carters got such a wonderful collection, were there any images that you picked because of the technical expertise necessarily in your choice of what's going on there?
Yeah, I would say all of them really are, especially the fine art photography. They wouldn't be in the collection as far as I'm concerned if they weren't of technical importance. You know, it's difficult, I think, for photographers to get into collections to begin with, let alone a collection like the Amon Carters, which does such a great job of collecting photography. So I felt that a lot of the photos were of great quality, but they also had this content to it. So I think that that was another aspect to this show, is that where some of the works had been shown before, we were able to give a further context about, you know, the works in a way that maybe hadn't happened before.
I was going to say the exact same thing. No, I think it's a good question. And partly we were spoiled by choice. So when I first proposed the show and brought Lauren on board, we didn't really know what we were going to find. You know, we didn't know if we had enough for a show. We actually had hundreds of images. So we were able to be very selective about both the content and the, you know, quote unquote technical quality of the images. And so some of them, like that daguerreotype, is, you know, a very proud image for us. We feature it in books. It's really important. But we looked at it one way before, which was focusing on the man in the front who commissioned the photograph. And the previous text on it from this museum had it focused on the young Black man behind him. So it was literally a new way to sort of frame things that we were familiar with when we'd focused on, you know, the hand gold leafing on that image and the sort of exquisiteness of it, instead in this new context.
And then, like, thinking about Wardja Garava, Gordon Parks, like, those are like heavy hitters in terms of like Black photographers that are like known for their masterful, like, technical style. So that was like, there was no question that technique was, you know, that was going to be a part of it when you have those type of photographers in the collection.
As curators, if you can go back in time, what would you tell your, say, 10-year-old self, if you could, to better prepare you for where you are now?
Ooh. I wasn't expecting. Do you have anything?
Well, I don't know if I would tell myself. I guess maybe I would tell my community, like, 'cause like at 10, I feel like I'm not fully responsible, you know, for everything that I learned. So like, I didn't get into art until college, you know, so there were essences of things that I got along the way. But that just wasn't a part of my world, you know? So there's times in which I might feel like, man, if I had known all this, you know, when I was 10, like where could I have progressed, or like with the knowledge? Like I talked to people like Vicky Meek, and like her parents were like cultural activists in Philadelphia and had her around, you know, all of the major, you know, Harlem Renaissance artists, Jacob Lawrence. I mean, like, she grew up with those artists like at her fingertips. And so just imagine what, like, so when she went to art school, she commanded respect. Like, look, I can do this. I've seen it. Don't tell me nothing. I feel like I didn't really have that, you know, so I had to really like gain that strength after the fact. after having gone through art school and kind of be like, I guess I kind of am where I'm supposed to be. And then it wasn't really into graduate school that I was like, dang it, where was all this knowledge? So I think that's why now, like with my kids, I'm like, we're going to the museum. I'm explaining all kinds of things where it's like my nephews, my nieces, just kind of making it relevant to them, regardless of whether they're interested or not, just feeding that, So I feel like I wish I had more of that in terms of like the environments that I was around. I will say, though, there was a big initiative, and I will stop. There was a big initiative in Houston when I was growing up, which has been documented later, where the MFAH reached out to the Black community, and they reached out to the churches and welcomed them to the museum. My church was one of those churches. So one of my first experiences in a museum was with my church. Mm-hmm. And I remember that. So when I read that, I was like, oh my God, that was me. Mm-hmm. I was one of those kids. So that is so important, for all of these different cultural spaces that we exist in to like reinforce the importance of art.
I mean, I'd say only for that, maybe I was always a really academic kid. And I thought that being successful in life would be like being successful in school. And I knew how to do that. And I have been pleasantly shocked and surprised and challenged by how collaborative being a curator is. I mean, this is one very formal example. But compared to academia, my entire job relies on other people working with me and me working with them. And so that's something I would have told the bookworm me at 10 would be like, actually, interpersonal stuff is going to be as important as the book stuff when it comes to being a curator.
And my answer kind of folds both of those in together. So like an expansion of what the adults around me viewed as excellence, because I think people, especially if they have a child that they deem as gifted, there's an immersion in science, or they have them around adults that are educators or doctors or lawyers. But I was fighting for like my life, trying to find like, where are the writers? Like someone introduced me to someone in publishing, and my interest in art came much later, but it was formalized really through inquiry, right? So being led by curiosity. Mm-hmm. And I knew pretty much around that age, because 10 is about fourth grade, that I wanted to become an adult that could read, write, think, and travel for a living. So I was just trying to figure out what was that and who was doing that job. And no one in my world could answer those questions until middle school. At Dunbar Middle, my English teacher, Jennifer Seavey, and I started studying abroad. And of course, if you're studying abroad, you're going to museums. And I landed at a museum, the first museum. I went to Hampton University, and they eliminated the art history department before I got there, which was very interesting. So I focused on communications, but the International Review of African American Art, which is a scholarly publication, is housed at Hampton University. So I was an editorial intern, but my office was like inside of a museum. So just like living and breathing those spaces, I just wish for children and kids and teens and everyone to just have a more expansive experience of what intellectual inquiry and intellectual pursuits can look like, because then that leads to you expanding your notion of like what labor can look like, which is why I focus on Black women's cultural and intellectual production. And that is sort of, I'm answering my own childhood questions in my work.
Yeah, totally.
We have 2 questions, I think, in the back, and then we're going to have to call it. So you have one over here.
I haven't seen the exhibition yet, but I'm going to. Fort Worth had their own famous Black photographer, the late Calvin Littlejohn. And I believe that when he passed, I believe his collection went to the University of Texas. I'm not certain. But does the Carter have some of his photographs? And his photographs, I mean, they depict Black life from, I think, the 40s or 30s maybe, up until the 90s.
We don't currently have any by him. I think we should. but we don't right now. And so that's why he's not in the show. And that was something that came up during the building of the show too.
Yeah.
And again, because we're a fine art museum with a particular history, we have tended not to collect in depth people who work for newspapers like he did, or sort of more photojournalism, but we do have those. And I personally think we should have some of his photographs being here in Fort Worth. Yeah.
All right, we have one more right here.
So I also didn't see the exhibition yet, but I will as soon as we get out of here. I just wanted to understand what the process looks like to identify and confirm that the photos that are selected are the right fit for the exhibition.
Yeah, I think it was a lot of conversations. I think first there's like looking at all of the works in the collection.
Yeah.
Like,
so we have a database, for instance, of our collection. We have a massive photography collection. We tend to say around 45,000 exhibition quality prints. So that's what we're starting with. And sometimes exhibitions, if they're lone exhibitions, are additive. You're looking for things to add. This was more of a subtractive process. So we started with what's in the collection, identified anything that qualified, and it's a whole other discussion to talk about how we identify that the people in these images are Black. That's like a really complicated, different scenario. But once we sort of got down to that group of a couple hundred images, then we started to go through the process Lauren's talking about of talking through them.
and there's also like a tangible thing, like where is the exhibition going to be located? And so there's only so many photographs that you can fit in. There's different, each photo is different sizes. Some are color, some are black and white. So you have to consider like all of the collection collectively. And then, there were times where we kind of like picked out the ones that we felt like, okay, this definitely needs to be in the show. And I think my initial cut was a lot more generous. I was like, didn't want to cut a whole lot. But I think we had to think realistically also about the space. So we had to had the opportunity to lay the show out, like using models and using the floor plan of the gallery space, just to make sure it would actually fit, because you could pick a whole bunch of works and then it wouldn't even fit in the space. And it might overwhelm because it's like too much going on. And then that was where the categories helped us, because then we could kind of have these pinpoints that, okay, this is what we want to make sure that we're covering these points because these seem to be the most common points within the collection. Yep. And then that helped us to trim down a little bit. It helped me.
Yeah, and I will say, I think cutting in this context also is a somewhat fraught thing because, not every show that we do has this as its subject. So there's a certain amount of pressure to show as much as you can because this is the opportunity. And for me, and that's balanced with, we want it to be a beautiful and elegant show. We want it to look like, in some ways, any other show, not in the content, but in terms of like, it should feel professional. It should feel elegant. It should feel all these things. So that was a pressure too, was we want to show everything because there may not be another show like this for a while, but we want people to walk into the show and feel like it has a certain oomph to it that we'd want any show here to have. And so that was part of the laying out, was making sure, okay, if we group these, we can get more in, but we can't make it look like, an antique store in terms of how it's hung. We want it to feel like something people are proud of also.
And that was a part of our display choices too. I think with the vernacular wall, like there was an intention that like we really wanted to show as many of those as possible. So there were conversations that we had with other museum staff to like identify like, well, how could we make that happen? And then with the excellence wall, that helped, identifying it as like, oh, this is excellence, allowed us to then display it as a collective versus like, one image after.
Yeah,
that.
so much of being a curator is logistics. And that was a wall where it's like either we give each one an individual label and we cut 3 works, or we put them on a group label and we get all 3. Yeah. So like every one of those decisions is one that we sort of thoughtfully made, which hopefully comes through in the show.
I'm definitely happy because more works in
Always
the
do
show
more.
that way.
And I will say, as employee of the Carter, there is more on our website too. So even things that we couldn't put, in the show are still things that we can show people in the study room if they want to bring a class or just come see a photograph on their own that are on the website. Some of them have resources attached to them. It's sort of, this is a peek at this topic at this museum, but it's not everything that we have.
I feel like that's a great segue. So thanks to all three of you. And please, you have 45 minutes to see the exhibition. So please head upstairs. Thank you, everyone.